Joining us now, former Chief of Staff to Vice President Mike Pence. Marc Short. Marc, I appreciate your time this morning. There's a lot to get to in terms of where things stand, but I want to start there with the Trump team. This is a dilatory tactic, one that they're well within their rights to make, but they have been quite clear that they're trying to push these cases off, particularly the Jack Smith cases, till after the election. I know the vice president and you repeatedly said while you guys were campaigning that this should be up to the American voters, not the justice system. Do you still maintain that?
Absolutely. I feel like it should be left to the American voters, particularly as it relates to the case in Colorado. But in this one, Phil, I think that you're right, that the president's legal team wants to delay this till after the election, hoping that if he's elected, he can put his own team in at Department of Justice. But in your earlier segment with Eli, and he went through all the different cases where you've jumped up to the Supreme Court, I think there's one that really has a very strong parallel, and that was 50 years ago in the Watergate case, where actually a district court had ruled that executive privilege was not blanketed immunity. And the special counsel asked the Supreme Court to take up that case, and they did, and the Supreme Court ruled that no, the executive privilege is not something that is blanketed. And that happened within 2 months. The district court had ruled in May of '74. Supreme Court came down in July. And I think, therefore, there is a precedent in this case for the Supreme Court to follow in denying the notion that the executive privilege applies even when there's been potential criminal activity.
Would you like to see that happen, given the precedent?
Well, I feel that it's not something that I feel like I weigh in as what I would like to happen. I'm just saying what the legal course of actions are. And I think that this is going through its normal process. And I think that the Supreme Court, again, has a precedent to follow in this case.
Well, Marc, it's been interesting when you look at there's no shortage of polling right now. But while this might not have an effect in a Republican primary, the legal cases, and again, we'll get to Colorado in a minute. I want to talk specifically about the special counsel's cases. It will. Several polls in a row have shown that in a general election, if Trump is convicted, that it would peel off a percentage of Republican support. And a percentage, even 5, 6, 7%, is enough based on what we saw in 2020 to swing an election. Given your concerns, given the vice president's concerns about Donald Trump and what you guys experienced, wouldn't you want that answer before the election?
Well, Phil, I sort of feel that you're right. The polling would suggest that if conviction happens, it does change the outcome for a lot of people. But I think our country is pretty polarized at this point. I think a lot of their opinions are kind of settled in on the events around January 6th. I find it, disquieting that the events leading up to January 6th are not more disqualifying in a Republican primary as to the state of where the party is and where many of our conservative leaders are. But I'm not one who advocates that the legal system should be the one that trumps the opinion of American voters. And I think that it's really one that has to be brought to the American voter to make a case. And still remained, as much as I've articulated, my belief that the president's actions were wrong around January 6th, that there's a real question whether or not that necessarily means it was illegal. It was wrong. It was, I think, to ask the vice president to basically put aside his oath to the Constitution should be disqualifying. But I think the question of whether or not that's legal, you should allow that to play out in the court system.
The point you're making, which is a strong one, particularly based on your personal experience, but it's also one you hear from other Republicans, mostly privately, sometimes publicly as well. And then they end up following, if you ask the question of, okay, will you support him if he's the nominee? And the answer is always yes. There's very rarely a break on that front. As a Republican, as somebody who's been in the party, has been at the center of the party for as long as you have, would you support him if he's a nominee?
Phil, I think there's a lot to play out between now and then. I think it's very difficult to suggest that I'd be comfortable supporting somebody who has put aside his oath to the Constitution and asked others to do the same. I think it's a fundamental oath that you take. Our men and women in uniform take that oath to defend our country. And so for me, it's disqualifying. At the same time, though, it's not something that I would want to be in a camp that's looking to help elect Joe Biden, because I believe so many of his policies are hurting our country. So it puts it in a very difficult choice where you don't feel comfortable really with either option. Yeah,
to that point, with the vice president, the former vice president, does he plan to endorse? I mean, this race is moving and it's about to kick into high gear. Does he feel like he can have an effect, and does he want somebody specifically?
I kind of feel that endorsements often are overrated. I'm not going to speak for him. I would not anticipate any endorsements coming from him in the near future, though, Phil.
On Colorado, at the time we have left, Judge Ludig is one of the a preeminent scholar in the conservative legal movement, but has also been one of the most unequivocal backers of pursuing this route on the 14th Amendment, Section 3. Is he off base here? He was so valuable to you guys in the worst moments leading up to January 6th. What do you think?
Well, Judge Ludig defended the vice president's position. To be fair, he was not really somebody the vice president spoke to until after January 6th. I respect his legal opinions immensely. I do not agree with him in this case. I think the reality is it's kind of hard to say if a person has not been convicted of insurrection, much less even been tried for it. It's not even a charge that Jack Smith has brought forward to suggest that a court could then say a candidate disqualified for insurrection, again, when they haven't even been tried for it, much less convicted. So, no, I do not agree with his opinion in this case.
And do you think this bolsters Trump's approval in the
Republican Party? I think it
does.
Yeah, I think it does. I think the reality is you've seen all the other major candidates now come to President Trump's defense, whether or not it's Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, Chris Christie, and I think that bolsters him. And the reality is that a lot of Republican voters feel that he is a victim of a political justice system, and that continues to bolster that argument. So sure, I think this helps him politically.
All right, Marc Short, always appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil.